One of the hallmarks of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive is that we like to give you all the information that is out there, a balanced look at what's happening so that you get to make your own mind up about what you think. We don't tell you what to think or how to think. We just tell you, here's the truth as we see it, and then you make up your mind, whatever. We've had a number of people that are actually one guy several times that fought on the Ukraine side of this war. We talked to a number of people who were very much pro-Ukrainian in their orientation. And we've had a few people on that from the Russian side. And this is now the second time we've had Aiden Menace, who was a former British subject who is currently fighting on the Russian side. He has been telling us a little bit about what things look like from the other side of the line. And we have Aiden back today, who is coming to us live from Russia. And so, listen, we're first of all very grateful to have you back on. Welcome back to the show.
I'm happy to be back on. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, listen, we've actually added quite a number of people that on our channel since you were here last. So a lot of people, this is going to be new for them. I wonder if you could just, first of all, kind of answer some of the obvious questions that a lot of people in the West have is, gosh, how can you as a former British subject go fight on the Russian side? Because the view in the United States and most people are thinking, well, gosh, everybody on the West is for Ukraine, of course, but you say not so much.
We have I think it's a silent minority of people that don't subscribe to the Western idea of the war in Ukraine. But of course, we know how it gets when people speak out either against Ukraine or for Russia. It can get quite serious. In the UK, for example, where I lived before, simply posting pro-Russian content on social media can get you arrested. I had a friend that flew a Russian flag in his property and was arrested for that. And of course, it's also ended up with people losing their jobs because you've got pro-Ukrainian supporters, which can get quite rabid, and they start contacting their employers with the stuff that they've posted on social media. So it can get a bit crazy, really. But I get the impression that the tide's turning now and people are starting to be more vocal in terms of at least not supporting the Bandera regime in Kiev.
I guess it's one thing to I won't go so far as to say there's a lot of pro-Russian, maybe there are some, but certainly viewing things in a balanced view among the British people and some in the United States too. But it's a whole different level to say, I'm actually going to leave the UK and then go over there to put your life at risk for the Russian Federation. So I'm really curious if you could kind of tell us a little bit about what was your personal journey that led you to literally risk your life to fight for a different country.
Well, I saw what was going on in the Donbass. I mean, I've said this before in previous interviews. The videos exist of the Odessa trade union building when you had Bandera soldiers setting fire to the building, killing women, men, women, and I think there was a pregnant woman among them. And they were simply protesting against the coup d'etat, which happened in Kiev. And then you had the Kharkiv bus bombings. You had the Ukraine Air Force dropping phosphorus in carpet bombing cities across the Donbass and gearing up for an offensive to take control of those areas. So, I was aware of all these crimes. And then you get to the individual videos of, women being assaulted. And I don't just mean physically as in terms of hitting. Of course, you had people which were put up on crosses and burnt alive. Then you hear the testimony of mothers that have had their young men dragged from their houses and shot in the street simply for not wanting to participate in the coup in Kiev. So when you see those things and you're aware of what the Western governments get up to, like I was aware of the UK government and their crimes over the years and their interference in multiple countries across the world, it it was a no-brainer. The final decision, I suppose, the final thought process was, I'm living in the UK. My tax money is supporting the people in the Bandera regime in Kiev, and I didn't want to be a party to that. So that was what really drove me. I had to help these people because I felt the calling in my heart, and I didn't want my money to go towards mass murder, basically.
Wow, that still took a tremendous amount of courage, even whether any of our viewers may agree or disagree with the position. Just on a personal level, that takes a great deal of courage, because you literally have, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically left UK and can never go back. Is that right?
Yeah, so they've got this thing called the Foreign Enlistment Act. So I've joined a foreign armed forces in wartime, so that would cause problems in itself. But then, of course, you've got the Terrorism Act, and they would probably prosecute me under that. And the fact that I've been involved in assaults on territory in the SVO, that could cause problems too, in terms of what they would consider war crimes. But of course, I've never harmed a civilian. So, but this is the lines which they would go down to prosecute me. So yeah, I can't go back home.
I'm just curious though, that I've seen quite a few British people have gone to fight on the Ukraine side. So would that not also violate that same law about foreign militaries?
You would think so. It absolutely would, because of course Ukraine is an independent state who are at war. So if anyone were to go over and fight for them, they should be under the same laws and brought to account in the same way. But we've seen the likes of Sean Pinner and Aiden get caught by DPR troops, which that's what it was back then before they joined Russia. And they were eventually swapped and were able to go home. And there was absolutely no police investigation into those guys. And now Aiden Naslin is back in Ukraine again.
Well, I guess that's nobody ever accused any government of not having double standards. Whatever works for them, I guess, laws aside. I also wondered if you could bring us up to date. The last time we had you on, you had just been, as a matter of fact, for those who may not know, when we initially wanted to have you on there, you didn't show up, and we were wondering if anything happened. Sure enough, it had. You had actually been wounded in action, had a significant leg wound before that, and that had kind of had you up in the hospital for a period of time. Bring us up to date on that. How are you physically?
Yeah, so originally the injury was, I was actually on my way to a certain spot to catch some internet so we could do the interview. And as I was getting ready, the blindash was hit with drone and shrapnel. Sorry, excuse me. Shrapnel came through and struck my leg, and I ended up in the hospital with multiple shrapnel wounds in my leg. I went to the hospital. They couldn't take the shrapnel out because it was deeply embedded into my shin bone. Those little tiny bits they could get out, but the larger shards they couldn't touch. And it's been causing a few problems where I had to go back to hospital to have an operation. Originally, they wanted to break my leg so they could get the shrapnel out, but I opted against that. So it was a minor knee surgery on the meniscus. So I'm okay. I'm at home resting. So yeah, since we last spoke, I had to go back to the hospital to have this operation. But I'm near and full fitness, thankfully. It still hurts because it's now winter. It's cold, but it's to be expected. I'm not limping or using a cane or a crutch anymore. So I'm kind of okay at the minute.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Now, you said in some texts that we had exchanged prior to this episode here that you're about ready to go back to the front, but not to the Russian unit you were in before, but to a professional military company, a PMC, as they call it. Can you explain what's the difference between that unit and the one that you left?
Well, the people I were with was the motorized rifle regiment. I mean, that's the That's under the Ministry of Defense, so it's the Russian army proper. Whereas a PMC, private military contractors, it's kind of they're under an umbrella company. So you have an umbrella company, and then you'll have these individual PMCs that kind of acts semi-autonomously, and they recruit their own people rather than recruiting people, say, through a commissariat, like a military unit that people would go and sign up for. Of course, they still would fall under the command of the Ministry of Defense, but in some ways, they can have their advantages. And some of these PMCs originated from what would then have been the Donbass militia from like 2014 to the point of the Russian intervention. So, I think that's the difference. So it would be a different contract under different people, but ultimately still under the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Well, so explain to us a little bit of how the Russian system works. So you were in that unit, in the Russia proper, as you say, but then you get wounded, and now then you have the option that you're going to just not go back to that unit, or did you have a term of service that expired? How did it work that you left that unit to even go to this next one?
I signed a contract. I was going to say last year, but we're in 2025 now. In December 2023, I signed for 1 year, so my contract expired a few weeks ago, and that allows me to either sign on the dotted line again, or I can explore my options. And I just felt I wanted to explore my options because a motorized rifle regiment is, it's pretty brutal. It's heavy fighting. It's the tip of the spear, and the attrition rates on both sides. That's where most of the casualties come from. So I just felt I want to explore my options and horizons, so to speak. So yeah, I think that's what it boiled down to.
And what's the difference between the motorized rifle regiment and this PMC that you've joined? What's the name of it, if you're allowed to say?
Right. So I don't want to say just yet, because there's still official bits of paperwork that I have to finish in terms of my contract. So I have to go back to my military unit in about a week's time. So I will let you know as soon as the contract's officially finished, because it's being processed to file for dismissal. But the difference is, of course, these PMCs also have storm detachments, is what they're known as in Russia, which is infantry assault. But they also have other battalions, other units like artillery, which is something that I am looking at. Also, I think you were a tankist, weren't you? So I think they have that option, drones, etc. So I just feel there's more of a broad choice for me, because before I just went to the military commissariat recruitment center, signed on the dotted line, and they decided where they would send me rather than myself deciding where I want to go. I suppose that's the difference. I kind of want to decide for myself this time.
And we've been playing on our show some excerpts and a bunch of media reports about how the Russian army is growing and getting bigger through recruiting, as opposed to on the Ukraine side, forced mobilization. One of the things that's claimed in there is that the financial incentives for people to join regular military units are pretty substantial in comparison to what the average person in Russia makes. Have you found that to be true in your original assessment, enlistment? And is that also true of the PMC?
I would say with the PMC, it's probably less so, unless you've got specialist training or specialist qualifications to bring to the table. I think it's dependent on that within the PMCs, but that's more of an educated guess rather than a fact. But in terms of the Russian military, in terms of Ministry of Defense, I would say, there's a financial incentives sometimes. Yes, I think that's fair to say. I don't think that's the final.
Motivator?
I don't think that's the. Yes, motivate. Yeah. So of course, people do get sign-on bonuses and stuff, which I think are quite public. They can vary in amounts, but yeah, I think it's in wartime. It tends to be in a lot of countries when they're at war. That sometimes is the case. So I know quite a few countries that did that. Even you'll start getting Western countries, if they're ever at war in conflicts, there's sometimes where they will offer financial incentives or other incentives. So it's natural. It's not like a dirty trick that Russia are using to try and snare people. It's your choice, but of course there are incentives. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I can absolutely validate that in the United States Army, especially when after the U.S. war in Iraq in 2003, when it turned into a large scale insurgency, and especially around 2004, 2005, we were having a big problem with troop rotations and getting enough people to sign on. So we actually had to have a lot of bonuses, et cetera. So I have some direct experience seeing how that worked during wartime. So nothing unusual about that. But the bigger issue, many people they would love to have some extra money, but money doesn't do any good if you don't think you're going to survive. What actually do you think, from your observation among the Russian guys who sign up, what is their motivation to want to risk their lives regardless of how much money they get?
One thing I would also add to the recruitment subject we're speaking about is last year, on average, they had about 50,000 volunteers signing up each month. So, when you look at the difference between that and people being snatched off the street and beaten and taken to military units in Ukraine, I mean, it's quite a contrast.
And another thing that I'd like your observation on, one of the accusations against the Ukraine side, because they do force mobilization, is that they've had, especially in the last 6 or so months, an increasing instance of desertion, people running away from the battle, et cetera. I saw a report out, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, that said that in comparison, that the Russian side has less, but that they do have some. Have you observed any issue with Russians deserting under fire?
No, absolutely not. And again, I'm not trying to be a propaganda mouthpiece. I've just not personally seen it. I've heard a story here and there of it happening. I think in general, in terms of when two countries are at war, especially to a degree like this, I think you're probably going to get situations like that on both sides. But in terms of Ukraine, that is off the scale. I mean, you like we spoke about in terms of the videos of forced mobilization, as soon as those people get an opportunity, they're going to run. And I'm aware of situations on the front line where you've had whole units that are, putting down their weapons and deliberately surrendering without even firing a shot now. And it's happening more and more. And that's why Ukraine usually use their National Guard or the fascist battalions behind them at the point of a gun, told to go forward. Otherwise, they're going to get killed by their own people. So, yeah, I think it's a serious problem on the Ukraine side. And I'm personally aware of many situations where that has actually happened and still happens.
And I wonder if you could also comment on some of the reports coming in from the Western media that when Ukraine soldiers surrender and when they give up, or that they're just taking POWs through combat action, that they're treated really badly by the Russian side. I mean, have you used that?
Well, I've actually been in a situation where I've actually seen Ukrainian prisoners of war, and no, they weren't treated unfairly at all. They're given food, water, and they're given medical aid if they need it. Now, of course, it's war. You're going to get situations where you're going to get those situations happening on both sides, but I've not personally seen it. Most of the friends I'm in contact with in different battalions and in different regions don't really see it. But I'll add a caveat to that. I think it depends on the type of soldier that has either been captured or has surrendered. If you're someone that's a fascist and you've got swastikas all over you, then you're probably going to get a slap or two. I mean, I think that's quite natural. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying I don't agree with it. I'm just saying that that's a fact. That's happened a few times. But if you're talking about a normal professional soldier or volunteer that doesn't have those kind of thought processes in their heads, or they're not extremists or Nazis or fascists, then there is no problem. But then, of course, if you're committing murder that's caught on film, and you're committing rapes that are caught on film, killing civilians and all manner of war crimes, and you've got swastikas all over you, and you're captured. I mean, yeah, you're going to be in for a hard time. But no, I'm not aware of them being mistreated in terms of tortured or killed. I can only speak from my experience.
Yeah, that's all we're asking for, definitely. One other thing that you've told me in the past as well is that the casualty ratio between the Russians and the Ukraine side is I think you said somewhere around 5-1 in the negative for the Ukraine side. So for every Russian casualty, there is 5 Ukrainian casualties. What does that look like in terms of real numbers on the Russian side? Because a lot of people want to say, the Russia's propaganda, they claim that they have very low casualties, et cetera, because they don't ever speak about any of these numbers. And I know you can't give any actual numbers for OPSEC reasons, but what can you tell us about how serious is the casualties on the Russian side?
So, I think if you were to average it across the front line, I think it is 5-1 ratio. But then in certain areas, if you were to go to Chazov Yar, or you go to the Kharkov region overall, sometimes that can get as high as 10-1. But in terms of casualties on the Russian side, again, yes, I do have to be careful. But then if you were to you're probably talking nearing on 1 million Ukrainian dead. And, that's a serious number. And it has to be around that, just from what I've seen, experienced, and from the guys that I know that have been involved in assaults. That's a high number. So you can do the maths without me giving you a definitive answer for obvious reasons. But I mean, yeah, I've been involved in it where we've suffered casualties. I mean, you imagine if you're storming trenches in particular, that's a high attrition rate simply because of how difficult it is. Sometimes you can get, and if artillery is being fired on both sides and drones are being used on both sides, and then you got air cover too, mortars, all that, it can get bloody. Trench warfare is absolutely brutal and is not nice. And I think sometimes we can glorify war and not think of the actual reality of it. So, I would say if you've got 1 million Ukrainian deaths, and in the ratio that I've used, that's probably as close as I can tell you directly an answer. And I'm not trying to avoid the question, Daniel. I just, you have to be careful when you mention these things, whether you're on the Ukrainian side or the Russian side.
Right. Of course. Yes. As a combat vet myself, I totally get that and wouldn't want to put anybody on either side of the line in any difficulty. I do have a question though, in especially since we've had you on the first time, if you've seen any change in the way the Ukrainian side fights. For example, here, I guess it's 2 or 3 weeks back, we had a show where we had showed some of the interviews with some of the Ukrainian soldiers who had been in combat. And well, let's just say that they looked like they'd seen some pretty tough action. Watch this.
Розбили. Ми відходили, відійшли. І багато з пацанів вже ніхто не хотів напередок вертатися. І так, якось так. А комбат почав збирати ще, там хто лишився, щоб ще раз відправити. Багато не хотіло йти, і то стало так, як підштовхом. Що жити хотіли всі тоді. Молоді хлопці, не дуже обстріляні були такі. Всі села, всі такі трудяги.
So that was one of there was several others that were in that same interview and you can just see on the face. From my own personal combat experience, which is probably not a shadow of what you and anyone in this war has fought, I can kind of recognize some of that. And I wonder to what extent you see any of that on the Russian side, that they have seen so many horrors of war that they're really struggling personally.
Yeah, I think the truth of the matter is you're going to get guys like that on both sides. I mean, I see maybe 10, 20 videos of these Ukrainian soldiers and their interviews every day, and it's as long as a similar line as that video. It's almost shell shock. But of course, most of these people also they're in assault. They're stormtroopers, so that's where the action is. You're storming trenches or urban areas, and it's just an absolute bloodbath. Yeah, I mean, it's natural. You're talking of storm battalions, assault battalions. So it's when you both sides are attacking trenches, trench warfare. I mean, you can just imagine. I mean, it's such a strange war in many regards, but. Yeah, you see it. I've been there with my battalion where, you have to do things which most of these people are volunteers. Most of these people before the war, or a lot of these people within my battalion before the war, were just normal everyday people. You can only train so much, but when you're in the thick of it and you're having to do things that maybe you're not designed to do, or you certainly haven't been trained for years in preparation for a much shorter time span. Yeah, you see this. I mean, it's slightly different because these guys were in captivity, and obviously by the looks of it, and by what he said, he wanted to live. So they've obviously surrendered. Of course, I've not been in a position where we've had to surrender, so. Maybe not to the same degree, but you can see a change in people when they enter combat and they've been involved in gunfights, and as I said, had to do things that maybe they didn't quite expect. Because it's you can have these ideas in your head and you can train, you can simulate, but then to actually storm a trench, storm houses or blocks of apartments. I mean, yeah, it's different completely when real life bullets are flying everywhere and bombs are going off. I mean, it can affect some people, and especially if you lose comrades too. I mean, they're your brothers. So yeah, I've seen the effect of what it has on people, of course.
And I want to show one other example here, because this is somebody who was not on the front lines, but also has some struggles. Here is a female drone pilot from Ukraine.
Люди не розуміють, скільки життів там закінчилось. Скільки, людей, навіть вони сюди не повернуться, бо їх тіла, просто не знайдуть. І, це люди, яких я знала, які до мене були близькі. Я не знаю, це прям жахливо. Це дуже страшно. Особливо, я не знаю, мені це прям дуже віддає. Дуже віддає, коли ти повинен, ти дивишся на чийсь труп і просто шукаєш, щоб не було нашої пов'язки. Для мене це тут найжахливіше, бо я не бачила стільки раніше смертей, і для мене це правда дуже важко.
Now, I know from our previous conversation, you've told me that you have also had comrades that have been killed in action, and I wonder to what extent you have some of these same difficulties.
I mean, I don't get upset to the same degree as what she has. I mean, we all deal with it in our own way. I would like to think I'm quite mentally strong, so I'm kind of able to hold it in. But at the same time, the war hasn't finished, so it's like I can't quite relax and think about it too much. I try and keep myself busy, because I think if I were to sit there and analyze it and go in my head, I think, yeah, you can have some of those same thoughts, man. It's tough. It's not easy to see people die, or if you're in a position where you've got to take someone's life, it's not not a video game, you know, where you can desensitize yourself and
let me ask you this, a little bit harder of a question, I guess. You have seen that before, so I mean, you've seen some pretty intense combat. You've seen some people die, but now that you're about getting ready to head in, how do you? I don't even know if the right word is cordon off part of your mental thought processes so you don't think about those kind of things. But now you're going into a place where, you know, God forbid, but maybe that next one is going to be you. How do you block that stuff out and still focus on doing your job?
Man, it's a tough question. I suppose people deal with it in different ways. I mean, you know, I try not to think morbid thoughts. Of course, you know, I'd be pretty stupid if I didn't realize that there is the possibility of that happening, especially now I've got a wife and a family here. But at the same time, I believe in the war. So it's like, I don't just want to sit here, as I said, because if I'm sat here and in my mind, I know I'm not going back and I'm finished, or I'm going to go into civilian life and get a job that way. I think that's potentially where the problems would start if I started trying to overanalyze it. So I believe in the war, you know. When I say I believe in the war, what I mean is I believe in what we're fighting for. That's probably a better way to phrase it, you know, because death and destruction is not something that I believe in, but I believe we're fighting for a just cause, and unfortunately, that's one of the side effects. So, really, it's a job that needs to be done, you know.
What is the just cause that you think you're fighting for?
Well, to drive fascists in Bandera ideology out of the Donbass, at least out of the eastern regions that decided to join the Russian Federation. And of course, it's also a de facto fight against NATO, you know, for Russia to have its place in the world and not be bullied or financially raped like it was in the 90s. Because in my view, that's what the West want to do. They want to subjugate Russia, and I genuinely believe that you have evil and demonic forces that run these countries in the West, and they need to be stopped. So it's something that, I'll be honest, Daniel, I'm prepared to die for.
And what do you say to those people who claim that Russia's real intent, Putin's real intent, is to conquer NATO, to go beyond Ukraine, and just once they have subjugated Ukraine, that they're just going to continue rolling to the West? Would you be willing to fight for something that's not just for Russia, but for territorial acquisition? Or do any of your comrades ever even talk about that?
No, that's not something we have spent time talking about. It doesn't really come up in conversation. I mean, it's not in any of our minds. That's not what we personally think that's going to happen. I think in terms of war, there will always be geopolitical goals that both sides want to achieve, but ultimately, I don't think that's going to happen, because if that were to happen, you would see a full mobilization of the armed forces in Russia, which hasn't happened. They're not even fully mobilized, which the world doesn't want to talk about. They try and portray it as an all-in Russian invasion, which it isn't. And you would see big arrow offensives, which you're not seeing. It's a hybrid war. And I get the impression, and I think personally, that it's about gaining's the wrong word, about liberating these territories that decided to want to stay with Russia. And of course, they want to denazify Ukraine. But to answer your question specifically, no, I wouldn't be involved in a war, nor would I want to be involved in a war if it's for territorial gain only.
So that's an important distinction here, because I don't see any evidence that Putin has any interest or even capacity to make good on that. I think that's just a fear tactic used by the West to keep the support for the war going. But I want to get to something related to what you just said there. I guess it was a week or two ago, Putin was asked about the potential for negotiations. And he's saying, well, listen, we're going to have to negotiate something. The Ukraine side is going to have to negotiate something, because he said his army can't be stopped.
Our army is progressing. They're making advances. And the enemy cannot hold the positions. They withdrew. They organized some defenses, but they cannot hold those defenses, because tomorrow they will be the next advance. So they cannot stop our army.
So you just mentioned that there haven't been any big arrow operations here. This is something I've been talking about to a lot of folks. I've mentioned it several times on this show. We've had Doug McGregor, who was just on. He and I had talked about this well over a year back, because we observed that because of the weakening of the Ukrainian lines, that a big arrow movement would put at risk breaking the lines and then allowing Russian troops to just flood through. But there hasn't been any. Now, many analysts on the Western side that I've talked to say, well, that's because they can't. Russia, this is all they can do right here. This is as far as they can go. Now, as someone who's fought on the line, what do you say to the absence of a big arrow movement? And is Putin right that his army can't be stopped?
I mean, in terms of this war, particularly in terms of the conditions currently on the front line, no, they can't. I mean, they are making gains all across the front line. Sometimes we forget how big and how many kilometers that entirety of the front line stretches. And, Ukraine are being stretched fully, especially in the Kharkiv region. I mean, just yesterday or a few days ago, you had Kurakovo. I've probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but that was, I think, the biggest settlement in Donetsk Oblast that was under Ukrainian occupation. It's now been liberated. And then you see places like Chazov, which is, that's not a nice place for the Ukrainians. It's definitely a meat grinder there. But yeah, everywhere that I'm aware of, that I've got friends in those battalions. So I'm talking of these people are actually fighting it. There's gains all across the front line in terms of where my battalion were. Or are in the Kupiansk direction. They're now 2 kilometers from the city center, and it's surrounded. So that seems to be the case of all these places and settlements that they're going for. I think it is unstoppable, and now you're starting to see the National Police Guards units being thrown into the fray. I mean, they're supposed to be policing the areas and the regions, and now they're getting thrown into the fray. And the fascist battalions are now having to be thrown in. They're relying heavily on foreign mercenary units, especially in Chazov and the Kupiansk direction. And from my information and from the people I speak to, that there is progress all across the line, and each time Ukraine try and make a counterattack, they get absolutely obliterated. So it seems they're getting desperate, especially if you were to take credence of the videos of them constantly kidnapping people off the street, which I literally see 20-30 videos of that now daily.
Yeah, that is great. I'm showing some of these places that you're talking about right now. And yet, like, here's also in Toretsk, where you see additional Russian progress in just the last 24 hours. But what do you say to those folks who say, well, the reason that there hasn't been any big arrow movements is this is just all Russia can do? Yeah, they're making these slow progress, but if they tried a big arrow movement, they would fail. What do you say to that?
No, I don't think that's the case. As I said, I mean, that Russia, this is what people need to understand, is Russia are not even fully mobilized. Their economy isn't on a war footing. No, they're not even using their full military might, which is, I know it might sound a bit strange to some people, me saying that, but it's a fact that they're working within particular parameters. And that's why they haven't tried these big arrow offensives. I'm sure if they fully mobilized, put their economy on a war footing, they could. But then we also got to add into the equation that Putin and the Russian high command are going out of their way not to harm civilians. And if people want to laugh at that, I'll simply say this: Russia have the capability to bomb Ukraine back to the Stone Age, completely wipe out their power. They've got the planes, and they've got the rockets, and they've got everything capable of doing such a thing, but they've decided not to do it. And then you ask yourself why. And that's where my answer would come into it.
So you say that it's a conscious decision to just keep it on the military side, not to like take whether it's Kharkiv City or Odessa in the south, or even some of these larger areas here so far, that's been the primary reason?
Now, in terms of Kharkov and Odessa in particular, I won't say that they are not targets or won't be targets, but I don't think you'll see them crossing the Dnieper, going right into, the west of Ukraine. Yeah. I don't think Russia have any thought process, or they have any. They don't want to have any of those regions outside the ones that have rejoined the Russian Federation. I think that's the fact, and I think the war is a hybrid war, of course, and they're not just demilitarizing Ukraine; they're also demilitarizing NATO as we speak. It's strange to a lot of us, and especially the military analysts across the world and in the West, because Russia are just not doing what they're expecting them to do. And I don't think that's because the Russian high command are inept. Quite the contrary, they're very capable people. I think it's a conscious effort of demilitarization of not only Ukraine but of NATO, which they're systematically doing.
I want to shift gears slightly and ask you a different question here. There was an interview last night with Volodymyr Zelensky and Lex Friedman on YouTube. It was released on a number of platforms there. And in the process of that, you had Zelensky was asked several times if he would have a negotiated settlement, and he said yes, but his version of a negotiated settlement is that he wants NATO membership for whatever's left of Ukraine. He wants a path to a diplomatic solution that in the future will get all of these territories you just mentioned back under Ukraine control, and he wants security guarantees from the United States. But he also said something interesting about the Russian side, which I want to get your view on.
More sanctions. It's okay. Not to take off sanctions.
That's okay with you, but it's not going to be okay with the president of Russia.
Yes, but I'm not thinking how it will be very good for him. He's still a killer.
I understand, but unfortunately, the reality is that a compromise is needed in order to reach an agreement.
In your understanding, the fact that he is in jailed after all the murders, he is not in jailed assuming all the murders, and no one in the world is able to put him in his place, send him to prison. Do you think this is a small compromise?
This is not a small compromise, and to forgive him will not be a small compromise.
To forgive, no one will forgive. This is absolutely impossible to forgive him.
So that's the view from the Ukrainian side about these conflicts. But there is a different point of view on the Russian side. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's been your experience here, because at least from like Telegram channels and some other things that I read on the Russian media, they also view what the Ukrainian side and the Western side together have done, what they consider war crimes against Russia and killing Russian people, especially in the Kursk area, et cetera. Are you willing to, better question, sorry, I didn't put it the right way. Do you think that you have, who's fought for Russia, and many of your colleagues here would be okay if there was a negotiated settlement between the two sides that ended up with NATO in Ukraine in NATO, first of all?
I think the idea of Ukraine joining NATO was probably what prompted Russia to finally cross the border. So I think that is an absolute non-starter. It seems we're an impasse, and no, I don't think NATO membership will happen at all. I think we definitely have to come to a negotiated settlement, because again, I don't think Russia are going to go. I don't think they've got no intention of going the whole way to Lvov or Galicia region. So there definitely has to be a settlement of some kind. I think the settlement will probably look something like the 4 regions that voted to rejoin Russia would have to be recognized and accepted. And I think NATO membership absolutely would be a non-starter, so I don't think that's going to happen. But then, of course, there would have to be a denazification of the people in Ukraine. So those are the conditions I think President Putin has repeatedly spoken about. And I think that anything short of that is just simply not going to happen. And I think that if it looks next year like no peace settlement will be reached, I think you may then be on the verge of a big arrow offensive, because I don't think Russia would tolerate much more if a peace agreement couldn't be reached next year in those conditions that I've just mentioned.
And what if one of the things that's being advocated by the so-called Kellogg plan of Trump's national security advisor, his envoy for Ukraine war coming in, is to freeze the line on the current lines, which means it's not all of the 4 territories. In fact, on that map I showed a minute ago, there's huge chunks of each of the, especially the 3 southern provinces that are still under Ukrainian control. Do you think that the Russian fighting men would, if it meant ending the war on the current line, would they be okay with it, or would they be upset at Putin if he didn't include all 4 of those oblasts?
So I'll answer the question. Putin has been very clear from the very beginning what the conditions would be for a settlement. And I think most of the soldiers that I spoke to, served with, or know, have the same opinion. So no, I simply don't think it's going to happen for a start. They definitely won't freeze across the contact line as it currently is. But in terms of, I personally wouldn't be happy, and I don't think a lot of my comrades would be. But then that's not is a tricky question to answer, because it sounds like the Russian army will then have problems with it, but it just simply won't happen. There will not be no freeze across the current contact line. You will see all 4 territories returning to Russia, and you certainly won't see NATO peacekeepers on Ukrainian territory. That's another non-starter.
Yeah, and in fact, let's play that. We have that soundbite for Putin when he said, "Here's what our minimum conditions would be."
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
That's really the essence of what you just mentioned a minute ago, that you and your comrades are actually fighting for. So you're not looking to get Western territory. You're not even looking to go in the western part of Ukraine, not even necessarily up to the Dnieper River, but those 4 territories, correct me if I'm wrong, that seems to be the minimum objective that you guys are fighting for.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I think we're all at least understanding of those statements from Putin. So yeah, that's definitely, we're all aware of that's the minimum. That's what we're fighting for. There are elements within the military that, of course, want to completely rid Ukraine of Zelensky and all of these people that are supported by the Western governments. But of course, you're always going to have polar opposite opinions within the armed forces of any country. So yeah, if those conditions are not met, then I think we're probably going to see an escalation of things, in all honesty, if those conditions aren't met.
And what would that look like? What would an escalation look like if the conditions aren't met?
Well, I think you'd get more troop buildups. That's for sure. Which you asked me that question the other day in messages. From what I'm aware, there are certain regions that is actually happening. So I think you would see an escalation, and again, I think you would start seeing traditional arrow offensives where they would, probably take Kharkov and try and take Odessa. But I'm not a warmonger. I know that sounds strange, me saying that, being in a motorized rifle regiment in the Russian army. But I want this to end. There's been a lot of bloodshed. And I don't like people dying, civilians, whether it's civilians or soldiers. So I want a peaceful end, but I will add into that I do consider Kharkov and Odessa Russian cities. After all, Odessa was founded by the Russians.
And is that common among the Russian soldiers that you fight with? that view?
Especially Odessa, 100%. Odessa and Kharkov are considered Russian by a lot of people. I think probably within the political sphere, you probably have a lot of people that would consider those cities Russian too. But I'll be honest with you, I can only speak.
Obviously, you guys are getting ready to go back into action here, and everybody is aware that Trump is about to come in, that he campaigned on a promise to end the war, that he wants to negotiate a settlement or so. So one would imagine that even the Russian side is eager to see what Trump can come in and do, see if he can negotiate an end, because it would certainly be better from the Russian side, especially if they could get a negotiated end without having to fight anymore and die anymore. But here's the question. If Trump is not able to deliver that, meaning if Zelensky doesn't agree to the minimum lines we just showed Putin fight here, but the Putin designate here, if no deal is made and Putin says, okay, now then it's no longer that June 15th, June 14th deal I just talked about. Now then we're going to continue fighting until we get Odessa and Kharkiv, which would probably mean another 6, maybe even 9 months of continued fighting. Would that be a disappointment and a depression to you guys to think now we're going to have to keep fighting for more? Or do you think that the Russian army would go, good, that's what we want anyway?
I think you'd probably get elements in both camps, to be fair. I can't speak for the majority of the Russian army. I can only speak for the people that, again, I've served with and that I know. But, I think sometimes there's probably a thought process of, Russia are fighting in a confined space, so to speak, in terms of they've got certain parameters that they're fighting within. If there is a certain element that want those parameters lifted, and if those parameters were lifted, I think we would see a swift end to this war. But of course, with that comes more bloodshed. But if an agreement isn't made and a political settlement can't be reached, then what does that leave? That leaves a military defeat, a total military defeat of Ukraine.
So would the Russian, do you think, I don't want to ask you things that you're not comfortable answering, but do you think the Russian people would support a continuation of war, possibly even close to another year, if they can't get that negotiated deal? And do you think the Russian people would continue to sign up if the war dragged on for another year?
Well, there doesn't seem any less people signing on the dotted line. You're getting foreigners coming over at an ever-increasing rate now to fight for Russia. And the difference is it isn't for money. They come from comfortable areas. It's for ideology. So, no, and I don't, unlike Ukraine, where you see the exhaustion in the people, in the cities, you can see the fatigue setting in. People are being snatched off the street and beaten and marched to the front. You're not seeing that in Russia. I don't see any war fatigue going on. It actually, quite the opposite. A lot of the time you can walk around and you wouldn't realize a war's going on.
It's fascinating. And
they haven't even got started, really.
So what would happen? So you implied, and I know you're not a general, so you can't speak to a lot of the plans that would be necessary. But as far as you're comfortable talking about, in the event that Putin came to the conclusion and decided, okay, no deal is the West isn't going to make a deal on my minimum lines here. So now then we've changed our objectives from June 14th to those 2 cities. And I guess really everything up to the Dnieper River, you would almost have to go that far. And to do that, we're going to have a mobilization and bring 500,000 people in, 1 million people, something like that. Would that cause the Russian people to finally say, okay, whoa, that's now then it is going to be a bother to us. It is going to intrude into our lives because people who don't want to sign up are going to have to, et cetera. Is that a risk that it would go that people would not support Putin in that case?
I think if you look at his approval rating, I think that would suggest that wouldn't be the case. But of course, a full mobilization and a full changing of the economy to a war footing, I mean, that is different. I mean, not even America and Britain did that in their limited wars since the Second World War. So I can't really answer that question in terms of any credibility, really. But I don't see any other situation other than predominantly and in a majority way, Russian support for their troops.
Well, let's. I hope we never have to find out. I hope these remain academic questions that never have to be validated on for the Russians who are fighting, for the Ukrainians who are fighting, for the Ukrainian people. Everybody, humans, all the people would benefit from a negotiated settlement at the earliest possible date, so we can get on to the process of rebuilding and just living lives. And I certainly hope in 2025 that we see that quickly, and I hope we don't have to find these things out. But in any case, we very much appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us today and giving us these frank, honest observations that you're seeing there. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
And listen, we appreciate you guys too. Like we say, we are unintimidated and uncompromised. We're going to bring you the truth, whatever it is, and you get to make up your decisions. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to slant and only give one perspective on something because that skews what's reality. And as you know, we always care about ground truth reality, and you just saw a dose of it right here today. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to have some great shows for you coming up later in the week, so you don't want to miss those. But in the meantime, we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.